Let's talk about slide deviation. So, and you know, whether it's us creating a webinar for you or you're doing it on your own, sometimes, well, a lot of times people will want to go off their slides. They'll want to start speaking extemporaneously or add color to the slides or throw in additional information to provide context. That is usually disastrous until you get really good at knowing that, because we often say far more than we should in order to try to make a point. And that cuts you two ways. The first way that cuts you is you're wasting time. The more time you waste, the less effective your webinar presentations are going to be. So adding in a lot of additional commentary on top of what's on the slides runs the risk of saying little more, but using a lot of time to say just a little more. Now, there's a second issue with trying to add a bunch to it to prove your point. You could look insecure, or you could look like you lack confidence by going on and on and on to really try to convince somebody of something. What we do as webinar sellers is we don't actually convince anybody, we persuade. We don't convince, we persuade. And so if I'm looking like I'm trying too hard to convince you of my point, you're actually going to be resistant of it. And so if you just keep going on and on and on about something to really drive it home, it usually has the opposite effect. And so you have to be very careful when you're adding in commentary or additional things outside of the slides, outside of what's written on them. Be very careful about that. Now, it's really, if you're good at it, it's fantastic because it looks natural. It feels smooth. It's interesting. And the audience has to pay extra attention because they might miss something. Notice, by the way, how I'm speaking in rhythm there and emphasizing things, all that kind of stuff, right? But for the most part, it's a pro move. You have to be very good at it. And I'm going to give you some practical ways of testing and getting good at it. Now, there's one more thing about variance where people want to go on, is when they talk about themselves. And so in your story section of your webinar, this is who I am, that's when you want to go off the slides the least. Even I was training my team the other day. I said, look at these presentations. So I pulled up a couple of my pitch presentations and I say, look at how quickly, let me deliver to you in real time off of these slides, how quickly I do here's Jason Fladlien, here's who I am and why you should listen to me section, right? And I run through it, it's like 37 seconds or something like that. And I said, notice how often I went off the slide. And the answer was 0%. I said, this is where even I will adhere 100% to the slides, exactly as they are, because the tendency to talk about yourself more than you should is great. All right, now with that said, if you look at the webinar's 4 separate distinct sections, the introduction section, the content section, the transition section, and the pitch section, which is what I teach, right? There are certain times where it's okay to really just use the guidelines and not stick so strongly and specifically to the bullet points. And there's other times when you want to be very cautious of that. So the content section, believe it or not, is where it is the least important time for you to stick to the content. 2 reasons. One is most of you are already experts at content, or you should be, or that you should work on that. I could speak with no notes on what we're talking about here today, or with just a word or two, because I'm such a stone cold expert on the content portion of what we're teaching here today that I don't need a lot. And if you're an expert, if you're absolutely a black belt master at your content section, that's when you just really need the bullet points to know where you're going and what things are getting set up. And the visual crutch, or not crutch, the complementary visuals that the audience can see while they listen to you, right? So in the content section, that's when you can say things in your own voice or your own turn of phrase, because you're going to know how to do that better than we ever could do that for you, or any writer could ever capture you. So in the content section, that's when you can go with the most variance. Now, runtime is also important though. So you don't want to take variance, but make the content section twice as long. You want to make the context section the same time in terms of delivery as if it was if you stuck very closely to the script, very closely to the bullet points, right? But you don't have to read them exactly as is. And you can add a little color here, or you can speed up over here, right? Now in the intro section, this is when you want to be a little bit more careful in variance, because Runtime on the intro section is critically important, because if you don't capture them in the first few minutes, you're going to lose them for the whole webinar. And people are the least tolerant of getting to the point in the introduction section. That's when they're most likely to be the hardest to please. And so that's why it's really important that we try to stick to the introduction section with as little variance as possible. Or if you do variance, be very conscious about that variance and be very calculated about it. Now, there's some wiggle room, of course. You don't have to be maniacal with it. But that's just the consideration. Now, in the transition section and the pitch section, that's when you want to have the least amount of variance as possible. Because that's when words are very critical in terms of adding to the success or detracting from the success of your conversion. So that's when you want to be the most cautious about going and deviating from the script or changing the slides or kind of skipping over slides or adding in a lot of commentary on top of the slides. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that's when you want to be the most cautious about it, okay? Now let me give you a little tip if you want to add to the bullet points. So say you got 3 bullet points, and let's say each bullet point is about a sentence length. You should never add more than 3 sentences to any 1 sentence bullet point. So if it takes you 10 seconds to read that bullet point, you should only add at most 30 additional seconds of commentary on top of that, at most. Usually it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So if it takes you 10 seconds to read that bullet point, you should only add 10 seconds of additional commentary, if any at all. And I'm not saying that you should always add additional commentary. Very often you shouldn't. But when the need arises where you feel like you have to say something more or add something to what was just said on the slide or in the bullet point, try to discipline yourself as much of only adding in something that is of equal length to what you just said. Okay? And then don't add in an extra thing to every single slide, every single bullet point, because you would double your runtime at the very least if you had a 1-to-1 ratio. If you had a 3-to-1 ratio, you would take a long webinar then. You would add 3, you would take a webinar that would run an hour and you would make it run 4 hours, right? So usually I adhere to the 1-to-1 ratio, and I only do that when I think it makes sense to accentuate a point, punctuate a point, add something to a point, or say something on top of it, or add that extra little flair of drama, right? And that's really important. Now, what's cool about that is it's good practice too. So sometimes you should do it just to practice it. How can I be conscious of saying things very briefly and right to the point without meandering and wandering around, but still being able to go off script? Because eventually that's when you become incredibly good at delivery. When you could purely set up and not ever use a script and go. And I've done that before. I've done, my last presentation, or the presentation I'm going to show you at the end here today, the 5-minute clip of it with the companion guide on everything we talked about here today. That's literally in my head. I showed up, did that presentation in front of 1,000 people with no notes, purely reading the audience the whole time and using that to dictate where I led the content that was in my head. And then focusing 100% on the delivery of said content, right? You get there doing this a lot, like I have, and then on top of that, you just learn to practice by coloring in between the lines. So, saying one line that's scripted, adding one line off the top of your head. Saying one line that's scripted, adding one off the top of your head. After a while, you get really good at bringing it in and really punching that point home and setting a point up and so on and so forth.